Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this episode, Bruce Willis and Frank Grillo wage war against a hostile alien race in Cosmic Sin. In the year 2524, humanity has travelled across the cosmos, establishing a series of colonies, including on Earth and the planet Elora, ruled over by the Alliance. When hostile alien first contact is made on a remote mining planet, Alliance General Ryle, played by Frank Grillo, decides to bring in the disgraced Blood General James Ford, played by Bruce Willis, to lead a team to confront the threat on Elora, including Ryle's son Braxton, played by Brandon Thomas Lee. However, the mission soon goes wrong, and now Ford and his men must fend off against aliens that can possess human bodies and must stop them from reaching Earth. To look at Bruce Willis's recent career is to despair. It was only 7 or 8 years ago that Willis was appearing in major blockbuster movies like A Good Day to Die Hard, Red 2, or G.I. Joe Retaliation. Not good movies per se, but even so, Willis is still a very bankable lead. He's one of the most recognisable actors on the planet. And yet ever since then, his output has been entirely dominated by direct-to-video action movies made by the production company EFO, Emmett Furler Oasis. In fact, even while he was still appearing in theatrical action movies, he was also appearing in these EFO films on the side, so you get a real Bruce Willis movie, and then one where Willis has second billing, his face is on the cover, and he's in it for 10 minutes. And it's those movies that has become his primary output. And I guess the reason for it is they pay extremely well. They're about $1 million per movie, and the reason is that Willis only works one day on them. He comes to set, they rearrange the entire schedule so they can get all of his close-ups and frontal shots in one day, ferrying them around from location to location to location, and then spend the rest of the shoot filling out the rest of the movie and using a Willis body double. I know this for certain because I've spoken to people who have worked on these movies and know exactly how that happened. I also know this because I've watched them. They are sloppy, amateurishly made, as you would expect from the fact that they're clearly covering up the fact that their main actor wasn't even on set for the majority of the shoot. And it's genuinely embarrassing. Now, Cosmic Sin is not an EFO production, but it does have many similarities to them and some connections. The first of which being that Bruce is, of course, on the poster, second billed. Although in this case, he is actually the lead of the movie. I'll get into that a bit later. The main connection, though, is Corey Large, who is the co-writer of this movie, and he is one of about 24 executive producers that are always listed on those EFO projects, even though they look as incredibly cheap as they do. Now, Corey Large is the co-writer of this project. He also stars in Cosmic Sin, and he wrote it alongside Edward Drake, who also directs this movie. And they have a link to the last Bruce Willis movie, Breach, which was filmed and released in international territories as Anti-Life. And that was also written by them too. So it definitely seems like pretty much a reunion of the same team that worked on the very similar Bruce Willis movie that just came out 3 months ago. And believe me, Cosmic Sin is absolutely atrocious. I've been watching these Willis snooze fests for quite some time now, and as bad as they are, I don't think any of them are quite as bad as Cosmic Sin. Cosmic Sin is like a modern-day Ed Wood movie. Watching it, and watching Willis in it, is like watching Bela Lugosi in Plan 9 from Outer Space, with about the same level of body doubling. The first thing that immediately hits you about Cosmic Sin is how staggeringly cheap it is. This is a movie where the production values are rock bottom. It's the kind of film that opens one of those flash-forward sequences that immediately lets you know you're watching a pile of dreck because they have to bait you into keeping on watching it. Here's a sequence from later in the movie popped at the front really awkwardly, and then that's cross-cut with plain text captions bluntly filling in the history and world building of this future that rush by so quickly the audience has no connection to it whatsoever and doesn't have any time to absorb it. Isn't helped by the fact that that's also filled with lots of unfamiliar sci-fi terminology, so it might as well be written in absolute gibberish. and then the movie itself opens, and your jaw drops, because you realise that most of this movie is going to be filmed in an industrial warehouse, but they've tried to make it look like a futuristic military facility by covering it with lots of brightly coloured LEDs and fluorescents and bright reds and bright blues. Ooh, futuristic! No, it looks like an empty warehouse covered with really harsh, brightly coloured lights. It doesn't disguise the fact that it looks embarrassingly cheap. And really, this movie is about on the same production level as, honestly, watching fan films on YouTube. In fact, I've seen fan films on YouTube that have better production values than this movie. This isn't even up to the level of a sci-fi original TV series. This is about on the production level of an asylum film. It feels like one of those sci-fi B pictures from the 50s, but far less endearing than one of those. And if there's one genre you don't want to cheap out on, it's science fiction, because you need to make your world look convincing, and any cutbacks are going to show on screen. There's a reason why you don't see a lot of low-budget sci-fi for this exact reason. It tends to be fairly expensive, because otherwise it just looks laughable. And that's precisely what Cosmic Sin is. If we can see the cinder block walls, the no amount of coloured LED lights is going to help you. Oh, but you turned off the rest of the lights so we can't see the rest of the set. Yeah, not fooling anyone. Not in the slightest. And believe me, virtually every single budget cutback can be noticed on screen. In fact, it's fairly visible, because the world building is non-existent. It's 500 years into the future, and people are still driving cars? Frank Grillo, in his first scene, is driving a car that looks extremely contemporary. They've made no attempt to make it look in any way futuristic. It just looks like he's driving from now. And aside from a couple of fancy establishing shots where they've, put some CGI spaceships in them, it just looks like today, with maybe a couple of robots thrown in shot. Another obvious cutback is that people just wield regular Glocks. They just pull out, guns from our time. There's no attempt to make them look like laser weapons, try and fancy them up that way. No, people are still using Glocks 500 years into the future. Sure they are. You don't need to guess at how low the budget is. You see it on screen in the props. In the first 5 minutes of this movie, there is a moment where someone pulls a gun on an alien, and in extreme close-up, we can see that it's a toy gun. Like, it has the red cap around the front of it, to signify that it's not a real gun. They didn't even go to the effort of painting that out or spray painting it, anything. And that's the kind of sloppy, careless filmmaking that is endemic to the entire production. It isn't just that it's cheap, it's that it's lazy and unimaginative to boot. It genuinely wouldn't surprise me to hear if Cosmic Sin and Breach were actually shot back to back using many of the same sets just to make a little bit more money out of them, because it certainly feels slapdash in a lot of the ways that those kind of movies do. But then again, maybe it just feels slapdash because so much of the actual direction here is incompetent. The cinematography in the action sequences and the editing is bottom of the barrel. There are sequences in this movie that are so amateurish that I'm genuinely surprised that this ever got released. There's a sequence where Alliance soldiers confront the aliens for the first time who have possessed the human body, so they're kind of like zombies. And one of them hurls up in one soldier's face and supposedly melts it off. We don't see this on screen though, because that would require effects work. So immediately we've got a setup that doesn't have a working punchline. I certainly didn't even register that dude's face had melted off. And then one of them presses another against the wall and chokes him to death. And then you get a great shot of the guy's crotch as he falls to the floor. Clearly there was no thought given to where the camera was placed, how much coverage they were getting, or how it that would flow once it was edited together. So as a result, action sequences turn into overlong, incomprehensible messes, not helped by the fact that you have such sporadic footage of the ostensible stars of the movie that are clearly just pasted into the film whenever they can just fit them in there. And so as a result, there were moments in this movie where I genuinely didn't know what the hell was going on in it. Really, there were sequences that were so choppy, so confusing, that I really struggled to follow what was happening in this movie for large chunks of the running time. And that's not because it's a complicated, plotted movie, it's because it's that terribly made. Another example of where the filmmakers clearly didn't get enough coverage is in the initial sequence where they teleport into space and then skydive down to the planet. And the first major scene in that sequence is all the terrible green screen close-ups of the actors that they've inserted in that look really awkward. They're shooting them down from their chins and they look really obviously green screened in, but clearly didn't have very much coverage of that in there because most of this sequence takes place with CGI body doubles that look like action figures. You can't tell which one is supposed to be which isn't helped by the fact that they don't add any insert shots. Characters are banging together or getting knocked out of the sky, and you don't know which ones they are, because typically a movie would cut to an insert close-up to clarify which person that happened to. But Cosmic Sin doesn't do that, which makes the action unnecessarily confusing. This is basic filmmaking craft, and Cosmic Sin fails at it again and again and again. And we're on the subject of that space dive. Let's have a special mention for the mech suits the characters wear throughout the entire second half of the movie, which is genuinely some of the worst props and costumes I've seen in recent memory. It's pretty clear someone was asked to emulate the suits from something like Gears of War or movies like Edge of Tomorrow or Elysium. But the thing is, while those characters were in battle, they weren't travelling around in space with them, and so immediately it doesn't make sense in the film's world. Why would they be wearing these big bulky armours that don't protect them from the outer reaches of space if they're travelling through it? They've got these exposed sections on their body. Like, that doesn't make any sense whatsoever. And then you get to the costumes themselves, which honestly, I've seen cosplayers do better. Genuinely, they look appalling, but by far the worst aspect, and most hilarious part, are the helmets. The helmets have clearly come from a different set of costumes, and so they've got a screw-on bit at the bottom that has nothing to do with the open neck design that the rest of the costume has, and also the helmets are clearly too small for the actors. Their heads are like really squished in. You have these actors picking up these helmets, trying to force their heads into them, and simultaneously pretend to screw them onto nothing. It's genuinely the part of the movie that is most Ed Woodian, where they just went, well, the helmets don't fit the rest of the costume. Wear them anyway. It's so absolutely laughable. I've not even got to the script or story yet because frankly it's not even worth it to. The script is so dreadful. It's basically every popular sci-fi film for the last 30 to 40 years put in a blender and ground up into flavourless nonsense that doesn't make any sense whatsoever. In fact, the most fun you can get from watching Cosmic Sin is pointing out all the bits that they've pinched from other movies. I've already mentioned how they nicked the bit from the Star Trek reboot, but also among the way we've got Stargate, because the aliens open a space gate. Yeah, that'll get past the copyright there. You've also got the premise of Aliens, the Avengers, because you've got a big space hole with an alien army on the other side of it, and also they decide to just nick the climax of that movie as well whilst they're at it. Speaking of climaxes taken from other movies, they also dive into Bruce Willis's own back catalogue, because the ending of this movie is also a rip-off of the one for Armageddon. Yes, really. In fact, that's not just the only bad film they're pilfering on, because it doesn't even matter if they were good the first time around. This movie's aliens, or the possession plot that it has, is clearly lifted from John Carpenter's Ghosts of Mars. that wasn't even a good movie the first time around, and somehow you've made an even worse one out of it. Not to mention the fact that it's just the writers using the exact same idea that they already had in the last Bruce Willis sci-fi film Breach, which was basically Bruce Willis fighting alien zombies with a bit of the Thing thrown in for good measure. And that's how nakedly derivative this movie is. And then you've got the dialogue, which is almost unspeakably bad. Some of the lines in this movie are genuinely toe-curlingly awful. It comes in two flavours: terribly written exposition dialogue that drags on forever and ever, and terribly written world-building dialogue filled with sci-fi colloquialisms that no one would ever say. For example, engineers are called wrenches in this world, like they're characters in a first-person shooter game. Just call them engineers, especially when that character is a woman, because it sounds like all the characters are calling her a wench. It doesn't also help that you've got characters throwing around terminology that makes no sense, like Q-bomb, which I guess stands for quantum bomb, or tachyon interference. What the hell does that even mean? It's the kind of techno-babble that would make Geordie the Forge weep. And then we get to Bruce Willis in this movie, and if you've seen a recent Willis film, you know exactly what to expect. In fact, the first time he pops up in this movie, it's not Willis, it's his body double. His body double gets the big entrance here in an elaborate tracking shot following him as he walks into a bar. And for the first half of that bar scene, it's still not Bruce Willis. He does eventually show up, and it's not that much of an improvement, but you can start playing a game of Willis, not Willis, Willis, not Willis, because the body doubling is so incredibly obvious, especially because Willis's double, the back of his head doesn't exactly match. And I know that body doubling is commonplace on film sets, but when the filmmakers are having to work around you and having to fill in because you couldn't be bothered to show up, that shows contempt for them and the audience. That is genuinely Seagal-like. And when Willis is actually on screen, he's clearly visibly disinterested. You know, he's doing a signature smirk, but it's pretty clear the lights aren't on. It's pretty clear that he doesn't care about anything that's happening on screen, being fed lines that he's saying but doesn't know the context of, so he gets really confused looking line readings, and it often feels like his scenes are just cobbled together in the edit with whatever footage they have. So there are moments where Willis is in the middle of a scene and he just starts smirking inappropriately in the serious scene. And while Willis is in this movie quite a lot, especially compared to his other direct-to-video movies, and he is clearly the lead despite being second build, there's still long stretches where he drops out of the action, especially early on and later in the second act, so the filmmakers can shift their focus onto other characters played by actors who actually bother to show up for filming. Puzzlingly, Willis is also followed around by an extraneous comic relief character, one of his former men, who's played by co-writer Corey Large. I'm presuming that Large is a last-minute fill-in for Luke Wilson, who was announced to be in this movie but then dropped out. So Large fills in, and Large again looks like a character that stumbled out of a completely different movie and is totally inappropriate, especially when one character dies and then he walks in having taken off his mech suit, so he's just wearing a t-shirt and jeans and just goes, "Who died?" It not only undermines a supposedly dramatic moment, but also there's a guy wandering around in a sci-fi movie in a t-shirt and jeans. That just looks ridiculous. And maybe the conception of the character is that he's so blasé, but really, it just feels incredibly forced. Oh, and while we're on the subject of Willis's character, there's a reason why he's called the Blood General. You see, the Alliance was formerly made up of 3 colonies, not 2, but the third one wanted to rebel and break off. So General Willis decided that his solution to this problem was drop a Q-bomb on them and suck up their planet into a black hole. Not only is that ripped off in the Star Trek reboot again, but his character kills 70 million people. Yep, he's a genocidal maniac, and that's why his character is disgraced at the beginning of this movie. And he's presented as a heroic figure. Yes, characters do challenge him on that decision, but it feels like the movie actually supports him on it, especially because there is a supporting character that pops up and says that they're really glad they brought him back. It was a shame that he was benched for so long after making that decision. If you're fighting wars, you need to have monsters to fight monsters. Except he wasn't fighting monsters, he was fighting people that wanted to rebel from the society that they were in. It's a bit different from that. So yes, this is also the movie that decides that it's going to excuse genocide and be rabidly pro-war. Fantastic! As if that wasn't bad enough. Ironically, Willis appears in this film more than Frank Grillo does, who is the top billed star of the movie, but he's only in it for about 10 to 15 minutes tops. Grillo has definitely been working a lot lately. It feels like every single week I hear of some new Frank Grillo project, and I suppose it's really easy to get that kind of churn rate up if you only appear in these films for about 2 to 3 days' work. And so, in this film, he does pop up, but it's very sporadic, and it's clear that he obviously wasn't around for very long either, and so the two leads in this movie are disappearing at different points. In fact, Grillo disappears for such a long stretch. He disappears for 25 minutes, the entire second act of this movie, to an extent that I genuinely wondered if his character got killed off screen, or if I blinked and missed it somehow. And then his character just re-enters the movie again, and it turns out he's still alive. Thanks for the clarification, movie. It feels like there's been some awkward rewrites there to try and give Grillo a bit more screen time and importance. His character feels very bolted on in the third act, and frankly, the way that he's reintroduced is unintentionally hilarious as well. It's really disappointing to switch on a movie where Grillo has the top billing and he's barely even in it. It isn't helped by the fact that the movie tries to do this dynamic between him and his son, which barely even factors into the movie. It tries to have a big emotional payoff for it at the end. The characters have barely even shared screen time, let alone affection for one another. It's all gruff macho bonding, and it feels completely false. Even by the standards of recent Bruce Willis films, Cosmic Sin is unbelievably bad. It's as close to unwatchable as you can get. In terms of recent Bruce Willis films, it might be slightly above something like Hard Kill, which was 90 minutes of shooting in a warehouse, but otherwise, this is among the very worst of his filmography. It is one of the worst movies I've sat through in recent memory, and a solid contender for the worst film of 2021, period. And I expect it to be bad. I didn't expect it to be this bad, and I knew that Bruce Willis didn't care, but I didn't know he cared this little. It's pretty clear that it's time to just give up on Bruce entirely, because clearly he's given up on having a career, especially once you look at his IMDb page and his forthcoming projects, which split between EFO films and films made by the team behind Cosmic Sin and Breach, including a film about a group of terrorists that take over a nuclear power plant and one man has to stop them. That's right, Bruce Willis is starring in a Die Hard knockoff. His career has come to a depressing full circle. If you like this review, then you can buy me a Ko-fi, or you can teleport over to my Patreon page where you can see my reviews early among other perks, including access to my Discord server. But until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.